Knight f3 is an interesting choice that is not without its poison, but a more aggressive choice that has also attracted grandmaster attention is h4. This may look like a beginner's move, but it's actually a serious try to gain an advantage against the Caro-Kann. It has been tried at no less a stage than a world championship match and is regularly employed by grandmasters. White grabs more space on the king side and prevents black's natural continuation e6. This would be a serious mistake as white can win a piece after g4. The light-squared bishop can try to run with bishop e4, but it certainly can't hide after f3, forcing the retreat bishop g6. When white marches forward with h5, trapping the bishop, so white simply wins a piece. Instead of blundering with e6, black can play h6, allowing white to build a space advantage on the king side with g4 and h5. A more solid choice is to stop the h-pawn in its tracks with h5. One popular option for white is to play bishop d3, and another sensible choice is to add pressure against black's center, starting with c4. Now that g4 is no longer a threat, black can return to the typical response e6, supporting the center while preparing kingside development. White may increase the pressure against d5 and develop another piece with knight c3. Black has an important choice to make. If black decides to centralize a knight with knight d7, adding pressure against e5 and hoping to support a future c5 pawn break, this allows white to play c takes d5, forcing black to recapture on d5 with a pawn, followed by bishop g5. Although there is nothing wrong with this approach, a more flexible choice is knight e7, preparing to respond to a possible c takes d5 with knight takes d5, opening up the d-file when the d4 pawn may come under future pressure. Although h5 is black's most reliable option, it does weaken the g5 square, and the h5 pawn itself may become a target. One way to emphasize these points is to play knight g to e2. Black can continue to focus on development while supporting the center with knight d7, preparing to meet knight g3, adding pressure against both the h5 pawn and light-squared bishop by addressing both of these points with bishop g6, reinforcing the h5 pawn. The dark-squared bishop can enter the action by exploiting the weak g5 square, pinning the e7 knight to the queen. When white activates the dark-squared bishop, black should consider the possibility of queen b6, adding pressure against the center as well as the space the dark-squared bishop left behind, the b2 pawn. White can explore sacrificing the b2 pawn with the sharp rook c1, or else keep more control of the position with queen d2, centralizing the queen while supporting the b2 pawn. A challenging idea for black is to play d takes c4, opening up lines on the d-file, preparing to meet bishop takes c4, with queenside castling. We have reached a very sharp position typical of the h4 advance variation. White enjoys a space advantage with more active pieces, but black has pressure on the d-file, especially keeping in mind white's vulnerable d4 pawn. White may decide to castle queenside, but another plan is to gain a tempo against black's queen with knight a4, followed by adding pressure down the c-file with rook c1, provoking interesting complications with no shortage of interesting play for both sides. Advancing the pawn to e5 is a serious way to test the Caro-Kann. A less critical, but still important option is to simply exchange pawns with e takes d5, c takes d5. As we learned in the advance variation, black typically wants to activate the light-squared bishop before playing e6. In one high-level encounter, former world champion Bobby Fischer, playing white in this exchange variation, decided to challenge this idea with bishop d3, developing the bishop to an active diagonal and depriving black's light-squared bishop of the desirable f5 square. His opponent, former world champion Tigran Petrosian, responded with the sensible knight c6, adding pressure against the d4 pawn. If white decides to defend the pawn with knight f3, this allows black to activate the light-squared bishop with bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen. So Bobby decided to play c3, reinforcing the center. Petrosian continued with knight f6, making a natural developing move and waiting to see how white will continue. Fischer actively developed the dark-squared bishop with bishop f4. We usually see knights quickly entering the game, but this unusual bishops before knight strategy makes it more difficult for black to comfortably develop the light-squared bishop. One interesting idea is to play g6, intending bishop f5, allowing white to double black's pawns on the f-file with bishop takes f5, G takes f5. Black is willing to accept this pawn structure in exchange for strong control over the light squares. Grandmaster Petrosian decided to activate his light-squared bishop immediately with bishop g4, attacking white's queen. Now that black has activated the light-squared bishop, the b7 pawn is no longer protected, so white responded with queen b3, adding pressure against black's center as well as the newly unprotected b7 pawn. Petrosian wasn't comfortable with the placement of white's queen and decided to play knight a5, disturbing white's queen as well as protecting the b7 pawn at the expense of misplacing black's knight on the edge of the board. Before retreating the queen, Fischer first inserted the useful move queen a4 check, provoking black to retreat the bishop with bishop d7. Now that the bishop has retreated, Bobby moved his queen to c2. After this maneuvering dance, white has a comfortable position, and although black is certainly doing okay, his light-squared bishop is less active than black would like, and the wayward knight on a5 will also have to spend time to return to the action. Grandmaster Fischer went on to win this important game on his path to qualify for the World Championship match, which he would also eventually win. Instead of playing Grandmaster Petrosian's knight a5, a more stable choice is to play queen d7, simply developing the queen while protecting the b7 pawn. White would like to play knight f3 without allowing structural damage after bishop takes f3, so a sensible choice is to first play knight d2. Black supports the center and prepares to complete kingside development with e6, when white is ready to play knight g to f3, creating the possibility of an unpleasant knight advance to e5, so former World Championship challenger Fabiano Caruana played bishop d6, protecting the e5 square, preparing to castle, and offering an exchange of dark-squared bishops. His opponent, Grandmaster Levon Aronian, accepted this offer with bishop takes d6, queen takes d6. Exchanging the dark-squared bishops involves a potential pawn sacrifice, allowing white to play queen takes b7. Of course, white does not have to accept this sacrifice and may decide to castle, following the simple, safety-first attitude of the exchange variation. But Grandmaster Aronian challenged black to prove compensation after queen takes b7. Although white has captured a pawn, this does open up the b-file, allowing black to generate counterplay with rook b8, forcing the queen to vacate the b-file with queen a6, when black secured the back rank by castling. Black may be down a pawn but enjoys a lead in development with an active position. He's prepared to gain a tempo against the queen with rook b6, followed by doubling rooks with rook f to b8, creating serious pressure down the b-file. Black has full compensation for the pawn, and even managed to win the game after some interesting adventures. Do not let an early exchange on d5 fool you. Instead of the less ambitious, although perfectly reasonable bishop d3, white can turn the game into the more dynamic Panov attack with c4, placing immediate pressure against d5. White is willing to accept an isolated queen's pawn position in order to generate active play. Black's most common response is to support the center with knight f6. The central struggle continues with knight c3. Black has three main ways to deal with this position. If you're looking for a straightforward as well as solid reply, then e6, preparing to complete development modestly with bishop e7, followed by kingside castling, is worth exploring. And the interested viewer is also encouraged to check out lines where black plays bishop b4, adding a Nimzo-Indian flavor to the position. If black wants to sharpen play, g6, preparing a kingside fianchetto to add pressure down the long diagonal, especially the d4 pawn, is also worthy of serious attention. Black's other main choice is to immediately add pressure against white's center with the sensible developing move, knight c6. If white wants to keep the position complicated, then the dynamic bishop g5, attacking a key defender of black's center, is definitely worth exploring. Black can provoke sharp complications with d takes c4, revealing the queen's pressure against white's newly isolated d4 pawn. When in doubt, e6 is certainly a solid choice, and the slightly strange-looking bishop e6, supporting the center, has also proven to be a reliable option for black. Another popular option for white is to simply develop while supporting the center with knight f3. Black could certainly return to the e6 lines we previously mentioned, but Grandmaster Anish Giri played the more active bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen, which indirectly adds pressure against the d4 pawn it was trying to support. Legendary Grandmaster Vasily Ivanchuk, playing white, showcases one key strategy in the Panov, compromising his pawn structure in order to test black's defensive skills. The complications begin with c takes d5, provoking knight takes d5. White attracts the knight to the d5 square and then plays the double attack queen d3, increasing pressure against the knight as well as the b7 pawn. Grandmaster Geary was able to damage white's pawn structure with the timely exchange bishop takes f3. Immediately playing queen b7 would allow the powerful response knight d to b4, when white's exposed queen and vulnerable king signals trouble for white. Ivanchuk continued with g takes f3. White's pawn structure has certainly seen better days, but black still needs to be careful. Like many other lines in the Caro-Kann, since black often delays kingside development, king safety must be kept in mind. If black tries to grab a pawn with knight takes d4, forking the queen and unprotected f3 pawn. There are several ways to punish this move, but the most straightforward is bishop b5 check. Capturing the knight would allow queen takes b5 check, followed by winning the knight on d5. And if black blocks the check with knight c6, this also loses the knight on d5 without any chances for counterplay.